Bonjour, this is Emery Brusset for Cordée, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Randolph Kent. I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of people who are becoming aware of humanitarian assistance, who are the humanitarian actors today, and who will they be? How would you define that?
Well, go back to this, I think by now, old example, but I think it's so relevant to the Ebola crisis in West Africa with Firestone. Now, Firestone had a considerable rubber plantation, and all of a sudden, the Ebola crisis began to happen. And of all the entities to respond, perhaps as quickly, if not more quickly, than the conventional actor, it was Firestone. Why? Because if our workers get Ebola, who's going to deal with our plantation? Who will deal with the rubber crops? What will happen, if you like, not merely in the West Africa, but in the Americas and elsewhere? And what was interesting was that Firestone actually responded very, very well. And basically, what was also interesting is the way that Firestone all of a sudden became empathetic. They became, if you like, feeding families, saying it's not merely the worker, but what can we do for the families? And all of a sudden, there was a kind of empathy that emerged initially out of that total self-interest. And I think you can find these kind of issues increasingly. Your interest is my interest, not necessarily to do with empathy, but basically because what happens to you impacts upon me and vice versa. So here we get to this whole question of entanglement. And entanglement and the closeness and the proximity is not necessarily an issue of virtue. It is not that we are closer together and hence we are more affectionate or, if you like, closer emotionally in terms of objectives, etc. Entanglement goes back to something, for example, like the Ukraine, where all of a sudden, because of the crisis in Ukraine, grain was not getting to states in Africa that relied upon it. What is the entanglement? What is the nexus? You see this increasingly all the time, and I think this entanglement issue has to be understood. And this leads then to this issue of mutual self-interest versus empathy. And I touched on it a moment ago, but let me say it now. Your interest is increasingly mine. And as I said earlier, it's not a question of being more positive. It's not a question of being closer emotionally. It is a very practical issue that if what happens to you might impact upon me. And again, who's the humanitarian actor? Is it the corporate? Is it the NGO? Is it a UN agency? Who, given entanglement, increasingly mutual self-interest, necessarily becomes the humanitarian actor? You know, the organizations that all of us are very, very aware of are the kind of top-down pyramidal organizations with the leader at the top. But real leadership, I think, goes to something that Steve McChrystal, who was then commander-in-chief of forces in Iraq, said. And he began it like this. He said, there we were. We had the strongest army in the country. We were the best equipped. We had the most effective communications. But the enemy always beat us. And then he said, and now I know why. because basically we always had assumed that orders had to come from the top. We always assumed that the leader had to criticize those who failed. But what we learned out of this is that the leader of an effective organization has leaders at the right level, in the right situations, and does not assume that everything has to, quote unquote, come from the top of the pyramid. And by the way, that leader is not a criticizer. Very often the effective leader is a mentor. Now, why and how does this all come together? It comes together because basically the humanitarian sector as we know it is still bound by traditional organizational constraints. It is still too top-down. Its innovation it comes, if you like, as a by the way, all too often. It's really and doesn't focus on anticipation, although, let me just say, more and more organizations, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, are beginning to pick this up. And if you look at organizational constructs, how fluid are they? Where do I look for my innovation? And with whom do I collaborate? And what kind of leader am I? So all of this then comes back to something that you mentioned, and that is over the past 50 years, I think what you'll see is that the constructs of humanitarian organizations have remained the same, compounded by what you might call the humanitarian marketplace, where ultimately I perceive my organizational survival depending upon how much resources I can raise, dare I say, at the possibly expense of yours. So all of this is where I think humanitarian organizations should be, where I think the world is getting to, where I think, if you like, entanglement is affecting us, and where I think mutual self-interest becomes a far more enduring point than just rather what has traditionally been empathy of a sort.
There is one question which I think people who connect with Cordée, with our project, which is to make humanitarian activities on the ground more accessible, what would you recommend they do? Who should they support? What information should they get? How should they orientate themselves?
I think that is such a fundamental question. How does one really get people who are vulnerable to get the kind of not merely resources, but the respect and the recognition that they need, rather than just moving in equipment? Why don't we do this? What can I do to enhance your capacity to do what you need to do for your benefit? When I give resources, do I also give ways and approaches for dealing with them? Point number one, really understand the people you're trying to help. Point number two, help those people help themselves. Don't assume that you provide and they will become dependent on yet something else. I never forget a meeting that we had with the relief and rehabilitation commissioner in Sudan. The government was being a bit restrictive and you can't move here without our permission and all of it. And then one day he assembled us all together and he said, the government of Sudan has made a decision. And that decision is that you, the UN system, the UN organizations, probably know this country in terms of delivery about as well as we do. And the next thing is that the government has decided that you can provide whatever assistance you think is appropriate, where you think it's appropriate, and when. A kind of ripple around the room. This couldn't be. This is something that we could never wish for, and here it is. But just before the Relief and Rehabilitation Commissioner stopped, he said, "Oh yes, there is one more thing that the government would request." And then everybody said, "Here we go." And then he said, "We want all your assets, all your resources to come through one source. What the government would like is for all resources, all assistance to come through one UN organization." And then all of a sudden, we went from impossible to he just doesn't understand. And as someone said from a large food providing organization, you see, you don't understand. We have our own resources. Each of us have our own resources, and we can't pool them together because we've been given these resources to distribute through our own organizations. And the reason that I mentioned that is here we have another example of, if you like, organizational constraints, the marketplace, and the traditional assumptions about what's needed and how it's provided. And that was a disappointed, and we all, so to speak, staggered away, if I can put it that way. But then I went back to my office and turned, and all of a sudden, there's a very fine, very well-respected humanitarian organizer, teacher, etc., named Fred Cooney, who is, I think, used to be at the time internationally known and respected. And Fred came in and we sat down, had a talk. I explained to him just what we were having at that meeting. And Fred looked at me and said, "This is complete nonsense. You don't understand the nature of crises and the local dynamics." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "How much are coming in to the port for the World Food Program?" I think it was something about 1 million tons. It was a vast amount. And he said, "I'll tell you what you should do. You should take about 1,000 tons, take it Darfur where the crisis was, and what you'll find is that amount of grain will then lower the market price because that grain is no longer rare, it's now accessible, and people will be able to afford purchasing it. And that's the way you get over the crisis. How well do you understand the local? How well do you understand the dynamics of the economic assistance and its consequences?" But then I said, "No, I understand, Fred, but you have to understand that I could never get that UN organization to agree to doing that." So basically, that also goes to your point. What do we need when we talk about humanitarian assistance to the people and for the people who actually we ostensibly attempt to serve? And it all, in such a fundamental way, begins with truly understanding them and not just making presumptions about what they need. That, I think, is the bottom line.
That's really great, Randolph. Thank you.